To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
When a 70-year-old grandmother was brutally murdered inside of her home in Delaware, the initial suspicion fell on the most obvious suspect, her son. But what unfolded next was stranger than fiction. A confession from a stranger, a bizarre case of mistaken identity, and the ultimate betrayal of forensic evidence. This is Forensic Tales, episode number 302, The Murder of Dorothy Donovan. It was after midnight in Harrington, Delaware, a quiet June night, the kind that felt almost too quiet for anything bad to happen. Charles Holden had just wrapped up a long shift driving his cab. At 12:30 in the morning, he pulled into a Hardee's restaurant at the intersection of U.S. Highway 13 and State Highway 14. He was tired and hungry, the kind of exhaustion that comes from driving strangers around town for hours. Inside the nearly empty fast food restaurant, Charles ordered a hamburger and a cup of coffee. He sat for a while, hoping the coffee would keep him up long enough to make it back home to his mother's house. Everything about the night felt normal. This was the kind of thing Charles did after a lot of these late-night shifts. But when he left the restaurant and walked back across the parking lot to his pickup truck, everything changed. As he climbed into the driver's seat and started to back out, he noticed someone standing right outside of his window. The man appeared out of nowhere, leaning close to the driver's side. He wasn't holding food. He wasn't leaving the restaurant. He was just there, staring at Charles through the window. So he rolled down the glass to see what the guy could possibly want in the middle of the night. That's when the man said he needed a ride. He said his sister was at the hospital about to give birth to her baby, and he needed to be there for her. Initially, Charles hesitated, unsure whether he should give this stranger a ride or not. He was exhausted, ready for bed, not looking to drive any more than he needed to. But the man pressed him. He really needed to get to Milford Memorial Hospital and be there for his sister. So eventually, Charles reluctantly agreed and told the guy to get in the truck. He wasn't going to take him all the way to Milford, but he did agree to take him part of the way. Harrington was a small town. Most of the people who lived there were very friendly, so why would this guy be any different? The stranger climbed into the pickup truck, and almost immediately, Charles noticed something wasn't right. The man's eyes kept darting around the cab. He seemed fidgety. He seemed restless. Everything about him just screamed trouble. After driving about 3 miles down Highway 14, Charles reached the intersection of Killen Pond Road, where he normally turned to make the half-mile drive home. He told the stranger that's as far as he was going to take him. If he wanted to get to the hospital, he needed to find another ride. Charles also pointed him in the direction of a payphone where he could call someone if he needed to. But the guy started to get mad, saying he needed to get further down the road and he wasn't going to get out of the truck. But Charles kept saying, "No, this is as far as I'm going to take you. It's been a really long night for me and I need to get home. Good luck." But instead of just accepting that and getting out of the truck, the man just got angrier. He said, "Listen, I got a problem and I ain't getting out of the truck." But Charles kept his cool. He could tell that this guy was acting strange and he didn't want any more trouble. So he just told him, "Look, I'm sorry, but you gotta get out." But instead of getting out of the truck like he was told, the guy did something else. He punched Charles across the face and demanded that he give him his wallet and give him whatever cash he had. But when he didn't do that, that's when the man reached down to the floor and grabbed a screwdriver. Instead of panicking, Charles grabbed his car keys and got out. It was a split-second decision. He knew that without the keys, the crazy guy couldn't drive off with his truck. But the guy saw what he had done, so he jumped out too, screwdriver in hand, and started running after him. Charles sprinted across the dark, empty parking lot toward the nearest building, Blake's garage. He pounded on the windows, desperate for anyone to answer. But it was the middle of the night. No one came. The man caught up with him outside of the garage. Raising the screwdriver like a weapon, he screamed, "I'm gonna kill you. I'm gonna kill you right here." His voice was full of rage. His eyes were as big as they could get. And once again, he demanded Charles hand over his truck keys. Thinking quickly, Charles tried to calm him down. He told the man to relax, that he would drive him wherever he wanted to go, anything to buy more time. And for a few minutes, that strategy seemed to work. They started walking back toward the truck together, but Charles knew this was his one chance. The second he reached the driver's side, he jumped in, slammed the door shut, and jammed the keys into the ignition. Before the stranger could react, Charles peeled out of the lot. Instead of heading straight home, he deliberately drove in the opposite direction of his trailer, making sure that the guy couldn't follow him if he somehow found another ride. And for the next few minutes, he sped through the quiet Delaware backroads, adrenaline pumping, eyes darting in the mirrors. Finally, when he was sure that he wasn't being followed, he looped back around. The man was gone. The parking lot was empty. Breathing hard, Charles told himself the whole thing was over. But what he didn't know was that the nightmare was only beginning. When he got to his driveway, his heart sank. There he is again. The same man he had just escaped was now standing in his front yard, calmly looking through the windows of his trailer as if he owned the place. Charles's blood must have run cold. How had this stranger found his way here? He had deliberately driven in the opposite direction to throw this guy off, so there was no way he could have followed him. And yet, somehow, by some disturbing coincidence, the guy had. Worse still, Charles's small trailer sat just a few feet away from his mother's modest farmhouse, where his 70-year-old mother, Dorothy Donovan, lived. It wasn't just about his safety anymore, it was about his mother's. Panicked, Charles sped off again, back to the Hardee's restaurant where his night had started. Outside, he found a payphone, and at 1:19 a.m., with shaking hands, he called the police. He explained what had happened, that a violent stranger had attacked him, that the same man was now lurking in his front yard, staring into his windows. But on the other end of the line, police dispatch didn't seem to share his urgency. They categorized his call as low priority. As Charles waited, pacing by the payphone, he frantically tried calling his mother's house to warn her. Ring after ring went unanswered. Dorothy never picked up. With each failed call, dread knotted tighter in his stomach. Finally, around 3 o'clock in the morning, nearly 2 hours after his first call, Officer Williams Kinney of the Delaware State Police arrived at the Hardee's. She found Charles still at the payphone, exhausted, anxious, and terrified about what might be happening back at home. He poured out the whole story to her, how the stranger had threatened him with a screwdriver, how he'd seen the same man prowling around his trailer, and worse, his mother's farmhouse right next door. He was certain something was wrong, and he begged her to come back with him. So the two drove to his property in total darkness, and when they got there, the trailer looked quiet and undisturbed. Together, they checked the doors, front and back, but both were locked tight, nothing broken, nothing unusual. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But Charles couldn't shake the dread in his chest. His mind was fixed on his mother, Dorothy. She always stayed awake until he got back from work. Always. If she wasn't answering the phone, something wasn't right. He asked Officer Kinney to check her house, just 60 feet away across the yard. She agreed, and the two walked together through the wet grass toward the back door. That's when they saw it. The small pane of glass in the door had been smashed. The jagged edges glowed in the beam of her flashlight. Whoever had been there hadn't knocked. They had forced their way in. Charles's heart must have been pounding through his chest as he walked inside. And as he did, he called out his mother's name over and over again, but got no response. They went room to room until finally they reached the upstairs bedroom. And that's when they found her. 70-year-old Dorothy Donovan was lying motionless on her bed. She had been brutally attacked, stabbed more than 24 times in the face, arms, and chest with a pillow covering her face. The brutality of the scene was overwhelming. But strangely, nothing else in the house seemed disturbed. Dorothy's purse was still where it usually was. Nothing appeared to be stolen. There were no signs of sexual assault. Whoever had come into this farmhouse hadn't been looking for money or valuables. They had been looking for her. Dorothy Mae Donovan was born on May 18th, 1921, in the small community of Burrsville, Maryland. She was the second daughter born to John and Ethel Bonney. She lived a full life defined by family, faith, and hard work. She was married twice, first to Wallace Holden, who sadly passed away in 1968, and later to Ralph Donovan, who also preceded her death in 1987. Throughout the years, Dorothy raised 3 children, 1 son and 2 daughters, and eventually she became a grandmother, a role that she cherished most of all. Those who knew Dorothy described her as a woman who found joy in the simple things. She loved tending to her garden. She adored animals, often doting on them with the same gentle touch that she gave her children and grandchildren. She was also deeply rooted in her faith. She was an active member of the Church of God in Milford, Delaware, where she attended services weekly. Her quiet strength, kindness, and steady devotion made her a beloved part of her community. By every measure, Dorothy lived the kind of life that deserved peace and dignity in her later years. She should have been able to enjoy her time surrounded by flowers, family, and her faith. Police estimated she was killed around 1 a.m., almost the same exact time Charles had first spotted the stranger outside of her house. But when investigators heard his account, their first reaction wasn't relief that he had survived or even sympathy that his mother had been murdered. Instead, it was suspicion. To them, it sounded less like the tale of a frightened cab driver and more like the kind of elaborate alibi a guilty man might invent. Detective Gregory Nolt of the Delaware State Police later explained that the sheer string of coincidences made it difficult to accept. Charles claimed he had picked up a random stranger outside of a Hardee's, driven him only a short distance, dropped him off, and then somehow, some way, that very same person ended up at Dorothy Donovan's farmhouse, a farmhouse he had no connection to, a family he had never met. And within minutes, Dorothy was dead. The odds seemed impossible. That just sounded like a completely made-up story. So when detectives sat down with Charles, they didn't mince words. They told him straight out. They didn't believe him. The idea that a stranger could walk less than a half mile in the dead of night and just happen upon Charles's property felt like fiction. It didn't seem plausible to them, and it seemed like he could have fabricated the entire encounter as some sort of cover-up. And as they dug deeper, troubling details emerged. Dorothy had recently taken out a life insurance policy, naming her son as the sole beneficiary. They also learned that Charles was struggling with money at the time, another massive red flag. Then came the most damning blow. When asked to sit down and take a polygraph test, Charles refused. He wouldn't do it. So if detectives were already convinced of his guilt before, that was the nail in the coffin. If he was really innocent, why wouldn't he agree to sit down and take a polygraph test to prove that he didn't murder his own mother? In their eyes, this wasn't the story of a grieving son caught in a horrific coincidence. It was the story of a man who murdered his own mother for money and invented a phantom hitchhiker to cover his tracks. For the next several weeks, Charles was suspect number one in Dorothy's murder. If he wasn't the one who actually committed the murder, maybe he hired someone to do it. The FBI, who had been brought in to help, also found it odd that a complete stranger chose Dorothy's place to begin with. They thought she had likely been killed by someone she knew. But slowly, cracks began to appear in the theory that he had fabricated the story. Detective Gregory Nolt and his team went back to the beginning, to the Hardee's restaurant where Charles said it all started. They began re-interviewing employees and late-night customers who had been there on June 23rd, and what they learned changed everything. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Charles hadn't imagined the stranger. They had seen him too. Several people inside the Hardee's recalled the man wandering from table to table, asking people for a ride. Others outside remembered the same thing, this disheveled, restless man approaching anyone he could. One witness even remembered watching him climb into the back of Charles's truck in the parking lot, just as Charles had described. Another recalled seeing the man chasing him near the intersection, brandishing what looked like a screwdriver. And the sightings didn't stop there. Residents near the Holden and Donovan properties reported seeing the man walking the neighborhood that night. One person even swore he had knocked on their front door before eventually making his way to Dorothy's place. So now, piece by piece, the phantom hitchhiker was no longer a figment of Charles's imagination. He was real. He had been there. And now investigators were faced with an unsettling truth. If this stranger existed, then maybe Charles had been telling the truth the entire time. Maybe he didn't actually murder his own mother for the life insurance money. Maybe he wasn't really lying about what he said happened that night. As strange as his story sounded, maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. On top of the witnesses, there was also the physical evidence. Charles had injuries all across his face, cuts and bruises consistent with being in a fight. He also had burns, as you would expect if a scalding cup of coffee had spilled during a scuffle. These injuries weren't the kind of marks of someone staging an alibi. They were the marks of a man who had fought for his life. Then came the forensic evidence. At Dorothy's farmhouse, investigators collected a bloody palm print on the stairway banister, along with 2 separate DNA samples. One from blood on the same banister and another from a light switch. None of those samples matched Charles Holden. That detail alone was almost impossible to ignore. If he had killed his mother, his DNA should have been everywhere at the crime scene. The bloody palm print should have belonged to him. Maybe he left it before or after the attack. But instead, the house contained the genetic fingerprint of someone else, someone completely unknown to law enforcement. And for the first time, police were forced to concede that Charles wasn't their guy. But at this point, the damage had already been done. Dorothy was gone, and for weeks, even months afterward, suspicion had painted him out to be the villain. Can you even imagine what it would be like to be accused of killing your own mother, even when you maintain your innocence from the very beginning? People, including the police, still think you're guilty. Later on, Charles described the experience as a big nightmare. Sometimes, he admitted, it didn't even feel real. He would catch himself thinking that he could just drive the short distance over to his mother's farmhouse, walk inside, and find Dorothy there waiting for him the way that she always had. But deep down, he knew Dorothy, his mother, was never coming back. Her murder also deeply affected her two daughters. One told reporters that her mom meant the world to her and that she would call her every single morning. The other said that had she been killed some other way, like maybe a car accident, she would have been more accepting about what happened. But to be murdered inside of her own home, her brother, the one accused of doing it, that was just too hard to accept. The FBI eventually put out a description of the hitchhiker. He was an African American who wore large glasses, had a slender build, and pockmarked skin. He wore brown dress pants, a brown plaid shirt, and dark, large plastic frame glasses with oversized lenses. Alongside that description, the FBI said they thought he was probably high on drugs at the time of the attack because of how violent it was. And because Dorothy had a pillow over her face, they also suspected she might have known him. They slowly started to believe that the murder was premeditated and committed by someone she didn't perceive as a threat. The scene suggested she never got out of bed that night, despite the broken window and the fact that every floorboard creaked in the house. They figured that she would have woken up if it was a stranger. The police learned that just 2 days before her murder, Dorothy told her daughter Brenda that she had heard some strange noises coming from her house. She even told her, "I'm afraid something strange is going to happen here. Something bad is going to happen to me." But investigators weren't sure what to make of that. Was Dorothy just afraid in general, or was there something specific about it? But even with multiple eyewitnesses, the description provided by Charles himself, the forensic evidence left inside of the house, the police had no luck finding their guy. For the next decade, the case remained stagnant. Very few leads came in, and it seemed like Dorothy's murder was destined to become cold. And once that happens, it's really hard to ignite new light into the investigation. So for nearly 14 years, Dorothy's family feared that was about to happen. It wasn't until the end of 2005 that the authorities got something. In November of that year, DNA that had been collected from Dorothy's trailer was put through CODIS, the National DNA Database. It was the blood from the banister and the light switch. They also submitted the bloody palm print, and within minutes, they got a hit. It was a perfect match to 41-year-old Gilbert Cannon from Delaware, Maryland, but he had been living in Delaware at the time. Instantly, he looked like a promising suspect. He was a career criminal who had been in and out of prison most of his life, including several arrests that required him to submit DNA. That's why his information was in CODIS. On January 18, 2006, police moved in. They arrested Gilbert Cannon at his girlfriend's house and charged him with first-degree murder, possession of a deadly weapon during a felony, and first-degree burglary. At first, Cannon denied everything. He swore he had nothing to do with Dorothy Donovan's death. But when investigators laid out the evidence, the DNA, the bloody palm print, the proof that placed him inside of her farmhouse, his story crumbled. Eventually, he confessed to everything. Cannon told detectives that on the night of June 23, 1991, he was high on cocaine and desperate for more. That's why he had approached Charles Holden outside of the Hardys, begging for a ride. Charles agreed, but when he wouldn't take him where he wanted to go, Cannon became angry. He grabbed a screwdriver from the floor of the truck and chased Charles down, threatening him. Charles sped off, leaving Cannon behind. With nowhere to go, Cannon started walking along Killen Pond Road. He passed a handful of homes, but the lights were on. Too risky. Then he saw a small farmhouse that was in the back. No lights, it was completely dark. To him, it looked empty. That house was Dorothy Donovan's. He broke the glass on the back door and let himself inside. The sound woke Dorothy up. Suddenly, Cannon was confronted not with an empty home, but with a terrified woman staring straight at him. In that moment, he later admitted, he panicked. Afraid she would recognize him, afraid she would call the police, he attacked, stabbing her over and over with a screwdriver that he had taken from Charles's truck. Cannon insisted he didn't know Dorothy and didn't know Charles. He hadn't chosen her farmhouse for any reason other than the fact that it was dark, quiet, and empty. He even claimed he was shocked later on to find out that Dorothy was Charles Holden's mother. He also confirmed he acted by himself. What he described was a crime born out of drugs, chance, and desperation. But the brutality of what he had done could never be explained away as coincidence. Deputy Attorney General Robert O'Neill originally pursued the death penalty against Cannon, but that was eventually taken off the table as part of a plea deal. And on April 24th, 2007, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Not only did this plea agreement bring justice for Dorothy, but it also officially cleared her son Charles. This deal meant that he was officially cleared. It was just a huge coincidence that the same hitchhiker who he had encountered earlier was the same guy who broke into his mother's house and killed her. But the damage his crime left behind stretched far beyond Dorothy's farmhouse. In the years between Dorothy's murder and Cannon's guilty plea, her children, Charles, Brenda, and Diana, were torn apart. They struggled to understand why Charles had given a ride to the man who would eventually kill their mother. For a long time, suspicion and grief fractured the family, leaving deep rifts between the siblings who once leaned on each other. Only after Cannon admitted his guilt did those walls begin to come down. For the first time in years, the Holden siblings could begin to reconcile and grieve together, knowing Charles had spoken the truth all along. Still, their healing came with its own heartbreak. On August 2nd, 2020, Dorothy's daughter Diana passed away at the age of 66, leaving behind the legacy of a family forever changed by a senseless act of violence, but bound together by the truth that finally emerged. Dorothy Mae Donovan should have been safe inside of her own home. At 70 years old, she had lived through loss, raised 3 children, and became a grandmother. She should have been able to spend her final years on this earth surrounded by family, gardening in her yard, and going to church. Instead, her life ended in a brutal, random act of violence at the hands of a stranger who happened to cross paths with her son one night in June 1991. For years, suspicion hung over Charles Holden. He lived under the weight of doubt, accused both quietly and openly of killing his own mother. Only forensic science could clear him. The DNA found at the crime scene all pointed away from Charles and toward the true culprit. When the name Gilbert Cannon finally surfaced through CODIS, it was forensic evidence that cut through 16 years of rumors, suspicions, and broken family bonds. Cannon's guilty plea and life sentence delivered justice, but it could never undo the damage done. not only to Dorothy, but to the family she left behind. Cases like Dorothy's remind us of two things. First, how fragile the line is between ordinary life and tragedy. How one coincidence, one chance encounter can destroy a family forever. And second, how crucial forensic science has become in separating truth from suspicion, in making sure the guilty are held accountable and that the innocent are set free from doubt. Dorothy Donovan's story is one of heartbreak, resilience, and justice delayed but not denied. It is a story of a mother, a grandmother, and a woman whose life mattered and whose memory deserves to be more than the violence that ended it. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers: Tony A., Sherry A., Nicola, Megan G., Ureli, Jerry, Ann F., Carol A., Shannon D., Lois B., Lynn H., Danielle D., Lucretia W., Brett R., Luz Raquel, and Courtney C. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or email me at courtney@forensictales.com. Thank you for listening and see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.